So this is Kanban Back to Basics session. I always think it's really great at conferences like this, but there's a lot of complicated topics I see here on the agenda. So I always like to go in there with a back to basics just to make sure that we are doing the right things at our core in our teams and in our organisations. So who am I? My name is Helen Meek. I work for Ripple Rock, but I also do some of my training through a company called Learning Connections. I'm an accredited Kanban trainer, which means I've been poked and prodded to make sure I've got the right level of knowledge to be able to convey out there to other people. And they do poke and they do prod. Trust me on that one there. I work as a trainer, I work as a coach, not just in Kanban, but also in Scrum and Lean and other agile methods. And so I like to be out there with lots of different organisations because that's where the pain is, isn't it? You have to feel the pain, you have to be down there on the shop floor. And so the experiences that I talk about and I teach are real, okay? So my Twitter details are on there, my email address is on there. You're more than welcome to get in contact with me after this session with any questions that maybe we don't get answered. So we'll dive straight in. So, what is Kanban? So Kanban is a method for directly improving your service delivery. Service delivery being the stuff that you guys do in your team every day. What we do is knowledge work. We take something in, we have to apply some thought process to it, and we then have to solve them in unique ways every time we have a new feature or a new piece of work come through to us. So when we talk about service delivery, it's about what you guys do in your IT teams on a daily basis. So it's also a mechanism for catalysing continuous improvement. And when we go through the principles, you'll see how we actually evolve that within the teams and how we actually create that environment. But where did Kanban come from? So Kanban was originally back from the 1950s, and that's because it was a manufacturing-led thing. So I like to show this picture here because it's actually taken from the Toyota production system. And what it is it's the first Kanban system that they physically used. So when they had their inventory just after the war, and they found that having lots of it sitting around or it was depreciating in value, they needed a system to be able to help them to understand when to bring more parts to the shop floor and to understand how many of these things that they need at any given time. So the way that they helped keep things flowing was they had these machines in the center of their factories, and then once I got to a certain point in my tires or my doors or whatever I was loading, I'd find a card. I would then take this card and I would go put it onto the rack that you see here, and this is a signal for them to pull more parts for me to be able to working on. So 1950s, how did we get to where we are today in the software industry? So David Anderson, so the founding father of Kanban in the software world, back in 2004, he started experimenting with different ways of working. And so he kind of then had some concerns about how Scrum was being applied, other Agile was being applied. And so he looked further. He looked into manufacturing. He looked at flow. And from that, he came up with something originally that they were using, which is called drum buffer rope. So if you've read the blue book, you'll know all about this. So drum buffer rope, drum because it's a heartbeat, buffer because we use buffer to help us to manage our queues, and a rope, well, you can't push a rope, can you? Okay? So drum buffer rope, what he was originally looking at, but it wasn't until he spent some time with Donald Reinhartson that actually they decided that what they have is a Kanban system. And it was in 2004 that they started putting this into practice in a company that David was working with. Interestingly, and I only found this fact out in the last 6 months, when people think about Kanban, what's the first thing you think about? What's the first thing? The board, the visualization. So the visualization wasn't an aspect of the original Kanban systems. So if it was implemented in 2004, when do you think the first visual boards came in play? 2007. So somewhat 3 years later, they actually physically started having these boards on the wall to help them to show their work. And so I asked him, how did you do this then if you didn't have it? Because it's the first thing that we always think about. And actually, it was done within TFS, the Team Foundation Server, the first precursor of that when it was all spreadsheets and very, very clunky. And so that's how they kicked off their Kanban journey. So what is Kanban really? When you look at this road, what do you see? Chaos, absolute carnage. So if you lived in the UK, what types of things would the guys do to try and help things keep moving? Roundabouts, especially if you live in Milton Keynes. Traffic lights. Yeah. Chevrons. We also have a card shoulder, which quite often they open up in terms of emergency. Obviously, quite a lot of the times now, we get the digital signalling signs to say 50, 70, you can change your speed. So we use all of these things as a signal. So how does this relate to Kanban? So in Kanban, what we need to look at is, what is the demand that you have on your system? So how is the work coming into you? What frequency is it coming in? What type of work is that? Is there patterns in the way that it gets implemented or times of year? So we need to know what the demand is on your system, the system being your team, but we also need to know the capacity of your organisation. So how many teams you've got, how many people you've got within those teams, what skills, we've heard the phrase liquidity, what skills liquidity do we have amongst them? Okay. So Kanban is about looking at demand of your organisation, the capacity that you've got, and matching the two. How many times have you been in an organisation where you've got a massive annual planning cycle at the beginning of the year, and they push lots of projects in, and everybody has to multitask? So who's working in those environments? Yeah? So multitasking is bad, okay? And Kanban is about focusing on working on one thing at a time and getting that done. So increasing capability is difficult and expensive. You can't just get a contractor in. You have to put the job advert out. You have to employ them. They necessarily don't have the right skills. You have to bring them in. So if I built an extra bit to this road, or if I brought a new person in, that's going to physically take time to do it. So I work at a large fashion retailer at the moment, and we went from 3 teams to 16 teams, and there's now 41 teams. And people just expect that you can click your fingers and you get all of those people. But actually, it's very, very difficult. We have to work out what is the work that we've got and match the capacity to that as well. So Kanban is a way to do these things, but it also is about encouraging flow. All of those things that you talked about, roundabout chevrons, changing the speed signs, all of that is about helping us understand and keep things moving and going around and round. So as with Scrum, there's some core principles and practices that go along with Kanban. So let's take a look at them. These you might not have seen before because these are relatively new and have come in the last 6 months. So these ones talk about service delivery. So understand and focus on your customers' needs and expectations. So we've heard about that a little bit this morning already. What is it that your customers need? How can we make sure that we give it to them at the right point in time and give them the flexibility to be able to change their mind? We want to manage the work and let people self-organise around it. So understand your demand, understand your capacity, and let the teams organise themselves. Your organisation is an ecosystem of interdependent services steered by its policies. Reflect regularly on their effectiveness and improve them. Okay? Spot the spelling mistake there. I thought I'd change that. So this is about thinking not just as individual teams, this is thinking about how you can map out your whole organisation in terms of an ecosystem of Kanban teams that have interdependencies between them, and we'd have to then work upon the balance about how we get all of those flowing in together. So Scrum talks a lot about feature teams. Kanban doesn't talk about the need for feature teams because not all organisations in their size and their skills are able to do that. You can't physically just have 10 teams that are all unique in size and shape and in the skills that you need to have run things. So Kanban says, yeah, absolutely, you can do that if you want, but you can also have services. So you can have a BA service, you could have a front-end service, a back-end service, and you work out how those ecosystems fit within each other. So they're the first set of principles, the service delivery principles. So the second ones are the change management principles. So the first one, and I think this is the most important one for me, is you start with what you do now. So Kanban is not about coming in there and putting massive amounts of revolutionary change. It's not about throwing away the old and bringing in the new, because we respect the fact that you've spent maybe hundreds of years building up your processes in your organisations, and actually there's some real value in those, and we need to have a look at them, and maybe there's just a few little tweaks that we need to make, and maybe that'll increase the speed, the value, the quality, whatever it is we're looking for to achieve. So with Kanban, you start with what you do now. And actually, when I train people, they quite often say to me, well, what is the Kanban system? You know, in Scrum we talk about not started, in progress and done. What columns do I need to have? And because everybody starts with what they do now, this makes it very difficult because whatever your model looks like now, we would model out in a Kanban world, and then we would look to improve from it from there. So there is no out-of-the-box solution. It's contextual to each of your organisations. So With the start with what you do now philosophy, we want to understand your current processes as they are actually practiced. So this is not what you think you do. This is about us sitting down and understanding exactly what do you do and being truthful about that. It's also about respecting existing roles, responsibilities, and job titles. So I'm not going to come in there and say, oh, you're not going to need project managers anymore, you're not going to need business analysts anymore, because we're going to respect what you do now currently. And so their roles may change over time, but we want them to evolve that themselves and not be forced change upon them. And so that helps people become part of the journey and actually take on board what it is that we're trying to achieve. So we want to gain agreement to pursue improvement through evolutionary change. So we want to make lots of small changes over time to your existing process to work out what parts are causing us problems. We'll tackle that, we'll make an improvement, we'll make the change, we'll measure the change out of the other side of it, and then we'll look again at the overall system and see what it is that the next and most important thing that we need to fix. So this isn't about me throwing away everything that you're doing, it's about interrogating and looking at and analysing and understanding the reasons where you've got to at this point of your life cycle. Now we want to encourage acts of leadership at all levels. So the same as Scrum, everybody within a team, within an organisation, you're going to have lots of information in your heads about what we could do differently to help the teams become better at what they're doing, help the organisation spread knowledge much easier and much quicker. And so everybody now has to have that active leadership. So I'm going to take this idea forward, I'm going to try it, and I think these are the results that I'm going to get. And so that might be my idea one week, or that might be your ideas the next week. Okay? So now everybody has a voice, and everybody's going to help to drive forward the way that we want to work. So they're the two main sets of principles. There is actually a third set of principles, but that's when you hit a scaled organisation, and I'm not going to cover those here today because this is back to basics. So then let's take a look at some of the core practices. So there's 6 practices in total. Can anyone name any? Oh, pressure moment. You've already told me one today. Visualize. So the first practice is the visualization. Then it's about limiting your work in progress. Now, quite often I go into a company as a consultant and they say, oh yes, we're running a Kanban system here. And I'm like, awesome, show me, show me. And I go and have a look at it, and fair enough, they have lovely post-it notes on the wall. But that's all they have. Okay? To really truly class yourself as a Kanban system, you need to have a visualization, you need to understand your demand and your capacity, and limit your WIP. Okay? They're the 2 things that you have to do to technically call yourself a Kanban system, but at that, it's a very shallow implementation, or sometimes we call that proto-Kanban. So the more practices that you do, the more that you'll add, and more improvement that you'll put in over time. So manage flow, make explicit policies, implement feedback loops, and improve collaboratively, evolving experimentally using scientific models and methods. And for those that were at Mike's session earlier on, where he talks a lot about the values, you'll see some of the values down the bottom there. So what do each of these practices mean? So the first one that you're going to be very familiar with is visualization. So here you've got a lot of what the practices physically are. You see you've got your columns. At the top you have your explicit policies. You can see the numbers that I have in my WIP limits. You can see that I have different ways of visualizing the work. This is a pretty standard one that I see in terms of IT development, but your organization might not be using it for IT. I work with a lot of companies who do non-IT based projects and still get the value that they need from Kanban. So types of things that you have on your board here, explicit policies, may be on column entry and exit points, may also be on columns, may also be on the type of work that you've got, okay? These are your state columns. State columns are the big main columns that you have, such as deploy, and they're split into 2. And here you have your buffers. So buffers help us to understand where the bottlenecks are in with your system. Bottlenecks being, where is work likely to accumulate? And if I had to put my £5 on it, I would say that typically accumulates within the test columns. And that's because quite often organizations don't value the test capacity and have more developers and less testers. Okay? So you can see here I've got swim lanes. This can help me to model my work. I might use that for feature projects. I might have a row for business as usual. I might have a row for incidents. I might have an expedite for really important pieces of work that have to happen. Ultimately, what I'm trying to look to do here is visualize as much as possible what the work the team is doing and doing it in a creative way so I can have like what I call the walk by factor, the cruise by factor. So I could walk past this board as an agile coach and I could get a sense of what's going on. Where are the things that are, not moving on because they're blocks? They might have red tickers on, they might have yellow tickets on there because there's lots of defects. So that might be a signal to me that there's a quality issue. All of my features moving across it. I've also got an abandoned because I quite often have teams that abandon work halfway through, and when I see that, little pound signs flash up in my eyes, and I need to understand how much work are we throwing away because maybe there's a dysfunction at the first point of the system. So I also have a weighting. You don't always have to have this. You might find that you have multiple teams that have to work together on the same goal. And so maybe if they're imbalanced, as in they can't get through the same amount of work at the same time or have the right people, you might find you have things waiting. So I tend to have a waiting column, but I would put a WIP limit on there because you don't want to have too much stuff bottling up, because that's a problem. That's something that you would then need to solve. So if you think back to Chris Matt's talk this morning, he talks about teams not always having the right skills to do it. This is a way that you could visualize it within your team Kanban system. So you might have different types of work. So you've got your different classes of service. So you've got a standard, so the work grows, the total cost of delay grows over time. You've got your fixed date. So if I think about ASOS, where I'm at the moment, if we don't hit the January sales, then we lose whole heaps of revenue. So that's a fixed date. We have expedites. Holy crap, we can't accept credit cards. That's a major problem for a fashion retailer. And then the intangible, stuff we need to do to improve things, probably coming out of your retrospectives. So whatever you can do to visualize things, to help you to see the flow of work, where there are problems, matching your demand to your capacity, using your WIP limits at the top, this is going to help us to be able to understand what exactly is happening and what the problems physically are. Now you can use boards, and there's a whole heap of ways that you can visualize, but you can also use tickets as well. So colored tickets, you can do check boxes of them, so you could say that have they been through all of these different teams. Shirt shapes and decorators. One of the teams I'm working with at the moment actually uses little silver stars, and they want to use them because the testers want to send back a message to the developers saying, this piece of work was awesome, I found no defects. And so they wanted to say thank you to the developers just for actually, testing and making sure their work was good. But you can use them for all different things. Sometimes you can have your high, medium, and low priorities. If you don't have an electronic system, you might have some sort of format in there to understand how many days this is going to take you. You can do that as little boxes you can cross off, or you can buy a little date stamp from Ryman's or WH Smith's and get the team to stamp them on there. So not all teams want to have swim lanes and lots of columns. Think about how you can use colours, tickets, shapes, decorators, the information that you have on them as another way of showing where the work is physically at the moment. I talked about mainly here physical boards. Physical boards are really good because the whole team can focus around them and it gives them something to, have as a heartbeat for the team. Within Kanban, it's also quite good to have electronic systems because we do tend to collect a lot more data, start date, your end time, how long things are going to spend in each of the queues. And so I do hold my hands up and say systems can be very, very useful for that information. If you do it in a physical way, then you might need to have a spreadsheet. And if you did want to do it that way, if you look at Troy McGuinness, it's not the first time his name's been mentioned, he actually has a spreadsheet which he's happy to give to you guys. So he's a statistician who looks and models data. So he's created one of these things for you so you can go out there and start using it straight away. Alternatively, you have tools like Link It Outside, not sponsored by them in any way, shape or form, but you can use them. They have the same sort of information and visualization aspects. So think about not just your boards, but how your tickets can help you as well. So the second practice is actually about limiting your work in progress. And the reason why we do this is because we want people to focus on finishing things. And that's a principle that's true within Scrum or within Kanban. In Scrum, we call it swarming. So we want people to work together to move things through our system as quickly as possible. Because if we're swarming and working on them and getting things finished, then actually we're going to have flow moving across the board as well. WIP limits are going to help us to have a pull system. So we only pull when we've physically got the capacity available, capacity being people sitting there doing the work. Once we've got the capacity, we then pull another piece of work through to help them. It's going to help us to think about working on smaller pieces of work. So quite often I'm asked, well, how many story points do each of these tickets need to be? Kanban doesn't technically use story points, but if that's what you do now, because of the first principle, start with what you do now, you would continue to use them until you kind of get to the point where you no longer need them. But if you do use story points, I would advise that you have them between 1 and 5 in size, and that size helps you to keep things flowing nice and smoothly. One of the sessions I went to this morning, someone's asked the question, my team only wants to do a stand-up once a week. And quite often I ask behind those types of sort of like statements, maybe the work is too big and so therefore they're not moving around as much and so they don't have to have the conversation on a regular basis. Keep things small, keep things flowing through your boards. 1 to 5 story points, 1 to 3 days is optimal gold-plated for Kanban cards on your board. It's going to focus to finish on working items, so the sooner you finish, the sooner you finish. We should stop teams thinking about starting lots of stuff. If they see a problem in the test, maybe there's lots of tests building up, maybe there's lots of deployments building up, then we need to get those out of the door, so maybe those lovely devs need to go and do some other activities as well. Okay, so Kanban is a holistic system, so it looks at everybody that's involved to be able to complete a feature going through that system. It's not about sub-optimization, it's not about test looking at test and developers looking at developers. It's about how can we help each other out to speed this piece of work through and get the value to our customer sooner, or so we can get some feedback sooner from them. We're going to want to stop multitasking. So we know from the stuff that Gerald Weinberg has done that every time we have to context switch, we lose about 20% of the total time it takes to do the task. And if you're working on 5 different projects, when are you going to get stuff done? Okay? So Kanban is about, again, swarming, focusing on things, getting stuff done, and not having lots of multitasking going on at any given point in time. So the next practice, so how we can actually work out some of this is by using Little's Law. So Little's Law is linked to limiting work in progress, and I'm not going to go in detail, and I probably wouldn't recommend you read the Google page unless you've got a PhD in maths, but even then I reckon that would probably still be quite difficult. But Little's Law tells us about the relationship. Quite often when I work with companies, when there's a problem, they want to throw more people at it, they throw more bodies. So the way that I use this calculation, and it's average work in progress over your delivery rate, gives you your average lead time. So if you have 2 of any of these different combinations, then you can work out what the other ones are quite quickly. But for me, why is this important to tell you? Because actually, if you want to change the delivery rate or your throughput rate, so how quick stuff's getting done, then you have to change one of 2 other factors. You either have to change your work in progress limit, or you need to change your lead time. So lead time being how long it takes you to get the job done. Okay? And the way you change your lead time is through improving the way that you work and reducing the time it takes to do something, such as manual testing versus automated testing. It reduces the amount of time it spends to do things. So if I change any of those 2 factors, then I can change how quickly things will come off. But you need to be very careful about your work in progress. So if you give people too much work than they can physically deal with, then it actually has a negative effect. So if you give the same amount of people more work, then your throughput rate will actually slow down and it will become worse. So if you want to change your WIP, you have to add more people to the system to be able to help keep the same lead times and the same throughput what you're using. You can use this calculation to help give some sort of level of forecasting to your backlog, but be very cautious if you do that, because it has some assumptions on how this thing should work. So Dan Vacanti's Little Flaw. So Dan Vacanti's Little Flaw is a great video to go and watch if you want to learn a little bit more about what are the things that you have to consider when working with Little's Law. Or you can speak to Dan in the break, because Dan Brown, Kanban Dan, absolutely loves this stuff. So initially, you can use Little's Law to help you to work out what your WIP limit should be if you've got a specific end date in mind. So you can use that to help you if you understand your lead time. But quite often, companies don't have this information. So what you have to do is just have a good old-fashioned guess. Okay? WIP is never one per one person, because inherently in the work that we do, there's always some waiting or there's some asking some questions. So typically if I was a developer or a tester, I might have one piece of work I'm working on, and I might have one piece of work that is waiting for something else. So I would set a WIP of one person for two pieces of work. My rule there is sometimes it gets broken, and that might be because of, in application support teams, you might have lots of waiting, okay? So I have been known to go up to 5 per person in an app support team. However, I would be wanting to understanding why are we waiting? Why are we not getting this information that we need when the work comes through? If it was so important, why aren't people responding to the emails in the first place? And so I would be looking at all the dysfunction and the problems and trying to reduce that WIP limit over time through the continuous improvement activities that I do. Okay? We can use things such as cumulative flow diagrams to help us show how we can see what's happening over time. We can also use our cumulative flow diagrams to show what our average WIP is and what our average lead time. So this is great because there's no time boxes, there's no sprint in Kanban. How do we know what's going on or how the teams did? What's the story? We use cumulative flow diagrams to be able to get that picture. But there's no science to this. You have to kind of say, well, we exceeded our WIP a little bit here. What could the problem be? And if you don't know about that, then maybe that's something that you could sit down and talk to the team or the organisation about. Okay? So what you're looking for is nice even lines that match your WIP and move in an upward direction to the right. These are really, really good for Scrum teams as well. Okay? So we use these to help us to manage flow. Now, also on the third practice for managing flow, you can use other tools such as lead time distribution charts. So these help us to understand on how frequently we're releasing stuff out. So down the bottom is lead time, so how long it takes to get stuff done. And then on the other axis, you've got card count. So I know at day 17, I released 1 card. Okay? So these are great for helping you to understand how long stuff is taking you to get done. You can then map onto that a distribution, and using that distribution, you can create something called the 85th percentile. And that is about having a conversation with your customers to say, if this hits the top of the queue, you have an 85% chance that you're going to get this in X days and less. And this is the way that we communicate to our customers rather than story points in a Kanban world. So you then need to start collecting this information, and again, if tools are available to you, then this information will be collected and you'll gather it over time. Okay? So this is extremely useful. Other charts that you might see to help you manage flow is the process chart or the control chart. Okay? This is probably the least used one in the Kanban world. This is a little bit more manufacturing, and you probably can't even see the dots on it. But each of these dots represents time it took for work to get through. So think about it as the lead time we saw in the previous one. It's the same information, but in a different view. And this chart uses Six Sigma to help you to understand what's outside of control and what's inside of control, and it's the one that are outside of control that we need to have a look at in retrospectives to understand, why was it really quick? Why was it really slow? What caused that? Could we do something about it? So we're constantly looking for ways to continuously improve. Another thing you can do to help you manage flow is your flow efficiency, but use this one with caution. Flow efficiency looks at how long stuff takes to get through your system. So it looks at the amount of working on time versus the amount of waiting time. Now, typically, managers, when I speak to them, they're expecting flow efficiency to be quite high. But in reality, it's relatively low. So flow efficiencies are between 1% and 5% are quite common. And anything over 40% is absolutely awesome. So you can use this with your teams, maybe not from the start, maybe you're looking for more stable teams, and just be careful about how you share this information. But this is a good indicator on whether you're spending lots of times waiting in your queues rather than actually flowing work through. Okay? You also have waste. Everybody heard of waste before? Might have heard of Mary and Tom Poppendike's 7 categories of waste, yeah? So Kanban has its own wastes as well. It talks about 3 different things. Transaction cost, so think of me painting my fence at the weekend. I didn't do that, I paid someone. But imagine that I was doing that. The value is me painting the fence. The transaction cost is me buying the paint, clearing out my paintbrushes, tidying up, throwing the overalls away at the end. Coordination cost. When I did some training with the Philippines the other day, the coordination cost was, it took me 20 minutes to get Skype working, okay? And the bottom one, failure load, how many things have gone through your system and not been what the customer wants, and therefore it's come back as a problem, therefore it's effectively wasted money, okay? So again, a whistle stop flow and helping manage it, you would also be looking at waste. So practice 4, making your policies explicit. So you saw on my visualization, I had them at the boundaries between the different columns. Think of these as kind of like your definition of done, but they're kind of spread all over your board. They're on your entry and exit points, they're on your columns, they're on your different types of work. Ultimately, you need to sit down with the team, agree the way that you want to work, document them, get them on your visualization, and revisit them on a regular basis, making sure that they're still relevant. Because if you start with what you do, some of that stuff might be very, very heavyweight documentation, but you want to improve that over the time, so maybe that documentation is not needed anymore, and maybe a lightweight photo is something that we need to have instead. These are going to help us to manage the work on the board, and also if you have new people join your teams or your systems, then it's something that people can look at and get instant feedback on how we're expecting each other to work. So practice 5, feedback loops. So we've talked about retrospectives already, haven't we, this morning, if you've been in some of the sessions. These are really important to still have within your teams. But you can get feedback all over the place. So your Kanban boards, they're going to give you instant feedback. Step back every once in a while and see what the patterns are telling you. What are you actually visualizing there? Don't forget you've got your Kanban meeting, a different way of saying your daily stand-up, okay? Ad hoc retrospection. I had a release that wasn't particularly going well the other day, so I got people together for 15 minutes around the wall. We quickly post-it noted, we moved away, and we had some actions that we needed to do. You've got your waste data as feedback, and you've also got the charts that I've flashed by you all as feedback as well. Don't forget you have managers and coaches within your organisations. More companies I see these days are getting agile coaches in to help. They can give you mentorship, coaching, leadership. They're going to help you to encourage self-organisations within the teams, and they're going to help you to focus on your team growth. So they're a great source of information as well. Don't forget, between teams, it's great as well to have conversations. If somebody else is doing something really awesome, go and have a look at it, find out what they're doing and see if it will fit for what you need and adjust it as you need be. Don't think you have to come up with new ideas. If you see something you like, go and steal it. So work across the teams, invite other team members to come in and run your retros or be part of your retros, especially if you are an ecosystem of boards. And don't forget, communities of practice are a great way to share the things that you're learning and to demonstrate what you're doing. And also your product managers, product owners, enter the word here that you use. They're going to be a source of feedback through your reviews and any ad hoc demos that you're going to happen to do. So feedback is good. It's from here that you're going to find out what your problems are, agree as a group of people what the actions need to be done, and then complete them, and then report back. So the final practice, improve collaboratively using scientific models and methods. It's a bit of a mouthful, that one. Doesn't roll off the tongue as nicely. What does that mean? So you're going to do some retrospectives. That was practice 5. Practice 6 tells you how we should think about these. And if I was going to summarize it is, see something that needs changing, set a hypothesis about a change that you're going to then make and the outcomes that you expect to see, and then measure it. That's what this practice is asking you to do. And there's lots of different ways you can do it. So you can use plan, do, check, act. So that one's from systems thinking. Here, A3 thinking. That comes from Toyota. I always forget where this one comes from. Define, measure, analyze, improve, control. Who recognises that one? There's another one, process of ongoing improvement. Up the top here, you've got Kanban to help you think about how you think about work. And again, Kanban Dan is a great person to speak to about that. Here, you've got Discovery Kanban. Patrick Stayart, he's here as well. He came up with Discovery Kanban, and that helps you to manage the process improvements that you happen to have. He has a great poster. Go to his website, and you can download it. And then finally, inspect and adapt. So you've got Agile. You've got the pillars, transparency, inspection and adaptation. So think about those with whatever you do. But set your hypothesis and make a change and see if it meets your needs. If it doesn't, then you've failed, and that's awesome. You've learned something from it, so make another change. But don't make too many changes at the same time, otherwise you won't know what you've got a benefit from and what you haven't got a benefit from. Okay? So with everything that you do in Kanban, it is ultimately an evolution. You're going to start somewhere, and where you're going to be in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, it's going to be very, very different. So whenever I build my visualizations, I never build them with tape, because tape becomes complicated when you want to move your board around. Initial boards, I will always build in string, because then you can change it as much as you like within the first few weeks, because you will. And if I go and see a company that haven't changed their board, it's highly unlikely that they didn't get it right the first time round. It's more likely that they're forgetting to improve and change the way that they're working. So you're going to change, you're going to evolve, but it's going to be at your pace. You guys are going to decide how you're going to do that over time. You're going to make mistakes, and that's absolutely fine. But ultimately, you must improve, okay? But start with what you do now and do it gradually over time. So Mahindra hasn't held up the card, so he's obviously either listening or he's not checking in on the time. Oh look, the card's now gone up, okay? So where next, okay? So there are training out there, and I do happen to run an awesome certified Lean Kanban Foundation training, quite often with my partner, Dan Brown, as in business partner. I just realised as I said that sounded really weird. Okay, let's hope the wife never sees this video. Edit that, edit that. So there's training certainly out there. I'm not the only provider. There's lots of people. Have a think about if that will help you. There's certainly the Lean Kanban University website. They do some great case studies. That's one thing that the Scrum community has failed to do, I think. Go to the Lean Kanban website. They actually have a lovely lady called Inga whose job is responsible for creating these case studies and visiting lots of different organisations, and it's a great thing to waft under your manager's nose. There's also Kanban communities. Dan and I run the Kanban Coaching Exchange. Has anyone here gone to the Kanban Coaching Exchange before? You awesome people. So look us up. It's on Meetup Group. It's a completely free event. We get great speakers that you've probably heard here already, and you get free pizza at 8 o'clock. Okay? So completely free event. But we are not the only Meetup group, though we're the best. So you can also have a look at the Limited Whip Society. That's run by a guy called Nada. And there's also a couple of Yahoo groups. There's the Kanban Dev and Kanban Ops, plus the LinkedIn community and Twitter. So if you tweet any of us or you email any of us, you will always get a response back to us, because we're very, very, very giving with our time. You've also got some great literature. David Anderson's book, Scrumban by Corey Laddis. Scrumban being a transitionary state between Scrum and Kanban, not a method in itself. The Goal is a great book to read as well. It's based upon theory of constraints. It's about manufacturing. The Phoenix Projects is software's kind of version of that. Obviously, you've got the Essential Kanban Guide, which Andy Carmichael and David have been working on, and that's completely free, and that's available for you to get a copy of. And Mike Burrows himself, Kanban on the Inside, which is probably the most up-to-date book that I've read on Kanban. So that's it from me. That was a total whistle stop, but you're more than welcome to ask me any questions right now, after the break, or any point over the next couple of days if you see me hovering around. So that's it from me. Thank you.